Welcome into Monday Morning MotoGP presented by Horsepower Rodeo. And we've got a really good show this morning for you. We're doing it live, as always, right here on TikTok. And then if you can't check it out live, we repost it on our YouTube channel at Horsepower Rodeo. So if you're watching on YouTube, thank you very much for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about Moto3. We're going to be talking about Moto2. We're going to be talking about a Marquez maniac. And we're going to be talking about Fabio Quartararo running out of gas yet again. And finally, at the end, we're all going to wrap it up by talking about how do you cure a boring race weekend. I've got it for you. Make sure you stay to the end so that you can get the answer to why, if you come out of a MotoGP weekend saying, well, that was boring, it's probably your fault. So let's dig right into it. I don't normally talk about the lower classes on this podcast. We try to focus mostly on MotoGP, but it felt like a really good weekend to talk about Moto3 and Moto2 because a lot of interesting things happened, let's say on and off track, but mostly on track. In Moto3, if you haven't been keeping track, there is a young Colombian who's breaking records by the name of David Alonso. Now, you think he's won 10, 11 races in this year? He's going to win more races than Valentino Rossi. I think in the lower class before he moves up, he has the most race wins ever in one single Moto3 season. The kid's on fire, and he always seems to know what to do. He rides around in 5th and 6th the whole race. He gets comfortable. Every weekend, they're like, looks like he doesn't quite have the pace to go with the very, very front guys. And by the end of the race, with 3 laps to go, the guy is leading. And he's winning. And this last weekend, spoiler alert, David Alonso won the Moto3 World Championship. With, 4 races to go? Again, he was that good. It looked like all of his competitors were ahead of him the whole race. He was kind of sitting back in 5th and 6th, and then finally just started to move forward, cut through the pack, got to the front, pulled a gap, didn't even have to battle in the last lap like we're so accustomed to seeing in Moto3. Just wins the race going away. But the thing I want to talk about is the celebration afterwards. A couple weeks ago, I think it was maybe even last week, he brings out a unicycle. At the end of the race, he rides a unicycle along a track, spills into the gravel, crashes on the unicycle, and has a huge celebration, big win. He knew how close that was going to put him to winning the championship, and that if he did everything right in Japan, boom, it's over. Championship wrapped up. So what do they do for the championship celebration? Well, his fan club brings out, the mini pocket bike he started on when he was a child. I mean, this is this big. He lifted this bike over his head at the end of the celebration. And David Alonso is not a huge man, so that tells you how small this bike was. Brings out this pocket bike, probably all of 40, 50 cc's, and just starts goon riding, doing donuts on this little tiny pocket bike with his brand new #1 championship helmet on. Of course, wipes the bike out, ends up flat on his back on the circuit, shouting, screaming, lifts the bike over his head. It was a fantastic celebration. And I think we like to say this a lot. We like to look at the past greats and go, oh my gosh, this reminds me of this. And, oh, who's the next Marc Marquez? Pedro Acosta has to be the next Marc Marquez. He can't just be Pedro Acosta. And I think with David Alonso, people are starting to see flashes of young Rossi. The personality, the fun, the joy he brings to the sport, the joy he takes from the sport. I even saw tweets this weekend that were like, are we sure that David Alonso is not Valentino Rossi's love child? Because Colombia is a great place to visit. We know Rossi likes Mexico. He likes South America. Is it possible that a young rider this talented, winning the Moto3 championship, winning basically every race this season, is it possible that he is some vacation love child of Valentino Rossi? While I don't know and don't care to know, I can see why people are drawing the similarities because this kid has fun on the bike. He's full of life. He's charismatic and emotional. He got emotional in Parc Ferme, feeling, all of the hard work, dedication, preparation, paying off, winning the championship, crowning himself world champion. for the Moto3 title. It's a huge moment for him. And he's just the right type of character that we need moving up through the ranks. Going to Moto2 next year, we'll see how he does. Is he going to have a Pedro Acosta type rise to MotoGP? You never know. Some of the guys that are great in the lower classes never make it up the ranks, but it was really fun to see him celebrate so purely. Let's call it a pure celebration. If you haven't seen it, go to social media, look up the David Alonso post-race celebration. A big congrats to him and his team. They've done a huge job all season long, and it's well deserved. So then we move to Moto2, and we move to Moto2 rider, Japanese superstar, at his home race, fighting for a world title. He would be the first Japanese rider to win a world title since Hiroshi Oyama. So it's like there's a lot of pressure on this guy. He's kind of come from behind. He was injured last year. He comes into this season. Takes him a couple races to get up to speed. He wasn't qualifying well, but he always races well. If he's in the race, it seems he can always move forward from no matter where he is. If he's starting 17th, expect him to fight for the podium. If he's starting 3rd, expect him to fight for the win. That's just what we have seen from Ogura across his Moto2 career. Now, he has said he didn't really want to move into MotoGP until he was a world champion at the Moto2 level. He left Moto3 a little early, didn't win the championship there. He wants a world title to bring home. And you can bet he wanted a home victory to go along with that. Now, he is moving to MotoGP next season. He is moving to that Trackhouse team. So this is his last season to possibly win a Moto2 title. And he just so happens to be sitting at the top of the standings. All good things, right? Until the rain came this week. We saw the Moto2 race on Sunday be red flagged a couple of laps in. Now, if you don't know, in MotoGP, they have 2 bikes. So if it rains, we have what we call flag to flag scenario, where the race may start dry and then they can switch to the wet bike, or the race can start wet and then if it dries up, they can switch to their dry bike. They can have one bike with each setup so they're ready to go. They can pull into the pits. There's no just putting your hand up and stopping a MotoGP race. That's not how it works. But in Moto2 and Moto3, they only have one bike. And so the rules allow the race to be stopped if conditions are unsafe for the riders, and then they can basically reassess and figure out how to restart the race. Maybe they restart it as a wet race, and then the teams get to choose how they set up the bike. And that's what happened on Sunday in Moto2. They started the race, it was dry, rain started to come down, maybe just a little bit of rain. Nope, it was a lot of rain. The track started getting wet. Riders were slipping, sliding, throwing their hand up. Something was wrong. They red flagged the race. Everyone goes back to the pits. While in the pits, the rain kind of subsides. So we're wondering exactly how wet the track is. Now, if you are fighting for nothing, if you're a Moto2 rider who's at the bottom of the field and you're fighting for nothing, and you're looking at these conditions and you're seeing everyone else going out to the track on wet tires, you might think to yourself, listen, if I go out on slicks, it's a gamble, and I might be slow in these early laps where the track is still wet, but what do I have to lose? And we saw a bunch of riders do that. We saw Philip Salach, Jeremy Alcoba, Zonta van den Gorberg. That's a freaking mouthful. Awesome name. We saw those guys take that gamble. They're not in a championship fight. Why not steal a podium with the conditions, seeing that all the other teams were going to a wet setup? Ogura had a lot to lose with a gamble by cutting a different way than the rest of the riders. We saw this with Jorge Martin a couple weeks ago. He goes into the pits in Misano. He does something different than everyone else does, and he's fighting for a championship, and it really bit him in the ass. So we have Ogura, who looked at the conditions. He's local. It's his home race. He's looking at the track, and he's thinking, I think it might dry out enough to go out on slicks. So he does. Hits the track, and the commentators were beside themselves. Everyone in the championship fight out on wet tires. Ogura starting on slicks. The track was still wet. Let's just be clear about that. It was not a dry track at the beginning of this race. And we saw him hit the curb and a lot of spray being launched by that rear tire. But he makes the gamble. And again, this isn't a guy who had nothing to lose. He's fighting for a title. He's got a little bit of a buffer, but he can't afford to throw away points. And I will tell you the most dangerous part of this race for him. is at the beginning of the race when A, you're on really slick tires, B, the track is wet, C, there's going to be guys on dry tires coming by you. You're going to be a little slower at the beginning while this track is wet, and you're going to be more cautious because you don't want to crash. And so he's going to be running mid-pack with a lot of other riders on a tricky surface. So any one of these riders could knock him offline, could lose the front in front of him, could lose traction in front of him, not to mention the other people who went on slicks who have nothing to lose. This is really risky to run in the mid-pack with slicks on a wet track while you're fighting for a championship. But he does it anyway. And 4 laps into the race, or maybe it was even 2 or 3 laps into the race, he was running around like 15th, 16th. Now he's moving up to like 8th, 9th. And then you look at his times and he was 2, 2.5, 3 seconds faster than everyone around him. And you knew he had made the right call. All he had to do was be that extra little bit careful. He couldn't run his normal dry pace right away. But you knew he made the right choice. Huge gamble, huge payoff. He gets to the front. He pulls through a 4-second gap. Now, unfortunately for him, he doesn't win the race because one of the other guys who also had made this massive gamble was able to kind of storm to the front and take the win. But Ogura takes a huge second place, a bunch of points in the championship. His rivals in the title were nowhere. They were on wets. They were 3.5 seconds back. Can't get in the top 5 because these guys who went on slicks made the right call. They occupied all top 5, top 6 spaces on the grid. But just the gumption, the balls, the knowledge to go out there and do something a little bit risky when there's so much to lose. That is impressive. I will say I have been impressed with Ogura his entire career. I thought he was fantastic in Moto3. He's been fantastic in Moto2. He's always seems to be in the fight. On race day, he just knows how to fight. He knows how to hold his tires to the end, which I think is going to be key for him in the move up to MotoGP. He's not one of those guys who just can burn out his tires in 4 laps and then fall backwards. I think he's got the analytical mind to figure out the puzzle that is MotoGP, and I think he's got the race instinct to actually make him a good competitive MotoGP rider. And I'm cheering for him in the championship in Moto2, especially after this week when it just felt like, given a really tricky circumstance, when he could have just kind of played it safe and finished in 10th or 11th alongside Sergio Garcia or Fermin Aldeguer, who he's fighting in the title with, I'm only going to lose a point or 2. Maybe I even gain a point or 2, given where they are. Instead, he makes the big gamble, he makes the big call, and it's the right one. It pays off. We love a gambler when it pays off. I love a gambler when it pays off. So congrats to him. Big second place podium. You don't normally see Ogura happy with a second place. He was stoked to be in second place this weekend. So congrats to him. Huge weekend for the championship. And I think, if my calculations are correct, that he can actually wrap up the Moto2 World Championship next week, or the next round, I will say, 2 weeks in Australia. So let's see if he actually can do it. His first match point of the year. Very good chance he can do it with a big result. And the fact that Sergio Garcia and Aldeguer and Joe Roberts and all these guys who were looking like they were menacing the championship have kind of been nowhere. And Aaron Canet just came on too late. So let's move on to MotoGP. And we have a Marquez maniac on our hands. And I should say that differently. We have a Marquez, Alex Marquez, being a little bit of a maniac in MotoGP. Now, after the crash with Pecco Bagnaia in Aragon, there was some controversy. People thought Alex was too aggressive. People thought Pecco was too aggressive. It was kind of declared a racing incident, I think. No harm, no foul, but Pecco had basically said, hey, I thought he rolled on the throttle and ran into me on purpose. He later cleared that up, saying that, in the heat of the moment, he just heard that engine rev, and he understands why they came together. He doesn't think that Alex wiped him out on purpose. Alex says, well, the damage to my reputation has already been done. Then this week, Alex goes wrecking ball into the back of Joan Mir's motorcycle, wedging the motorcycle up into Joan Mir's bike. Mir tows his bike through the gravel and then wipes out himself. So here we have Alex Marquez's bike being glued to another MotoGP rider's bike for the second time this season. And it's starting to feel that there are just a lot of incidents involving Alex Marquez. I think we saw in practice earlier, was it Jorge Martin or Franco? It was one of the Pramac Ducatis running into the back of Alex Marquez during a practice session or a qualifying session. And then we saw last week Jack Miller skitter out Alex Marquez. Then we said the accident in Aragon with Alex Marquez, and the accident this week with Alex Marquez. If you remember, was it a year or two ago where Alex was coming in to turn one. I wish I remember which exact race, but if you watch MotoGP, you'll know what I'm talking about. He comes, he's behind 4 bikes, and he kind of got sucked into the slipstream and had to let off the brake and basically thread the needle through about 4 riders at the front of the pack. Manages not to collect any of them through maybe just divine intervention. But he was way out of control, sucked into the slipstream, couldn't stop it on the brakes, almost hits his brother and all the other leaders. Pecco was there, I think Jorge was there, and miraculously he kind of got through unscathed, but it was like one of those like heart in mouth type moments where you're like, oh my gosh, Alex, what are you doing? A little out of control there, buddy. It seems to be a reoccurring theme. Now, for all the Marquez fans out there, obviously the Jack Miller crash was not Alex Marquez's crash. He got collected by another rider. But it does seem that if there's some trouble on track, that Alex Marquez seems to be in the middle of it more often than not. And I do watch him in practice and in qualifying, also with a lot of close calls and a lot of things that look a little riding outside his skill level maybe. And that is from an outsider. But that is just something I see when I watch Alex Marquez ride. He wants to keep up to his brother. Of course he does. There's a sibling rivalry, of course. They love each other. They're very, very close siblings. But he still wants to beat his brother. He doesn't want to be Marc Marquez's brother. He wants to be Alex Marquez. He would love Marc Marquez to be Alex Marquez's brother. But he doesn't quite have the full set of skills Marc Marquez has. He can't ride that GP23 the same way his brother does. And I think sometimes it makes him a little erratic. He rides a little desperate. He rides a little too out of control. And so when he says, well, the damage has been done to my reputation, when Pecco kind of calls him out, there's also done damage to his reputation by things under his control. This weekend, he's starting to be known as that guy who's a little bit reckless in a pack. And I don't think it's all that undeserving. Like, I like Alex Marquez. I kind of like the Marquez brothers this season. I couldn't always say that in seasons past. I've never been a huge Marc Marquez fan. I've cheered for Alex, especially when he was riding on his own at Honda, and it just kind of felt like he went to Honda, he went to Repsol to ride with his brother, and then Marc sits out with injury, bad luck. And he had some, showed some really good pace. He's really good at Aragon, so that was his chance to be really good. But I think what we're seeing from him is that he sees these chances in front of him and goes, oh my God, this is the last chance ever to do X. And he pushes so hard, he pushes beyond his skills, he pushes out of control. And then it's just disaster. And I think someone really needs to look at him and go, man, you really have to reassess how you ride, especially when you're in a pack. I know you're aggressive. I know you've got that same tenacity your brother has. But you can't be the guy that's involved in all these incidents. This reputation is going to be forming. This is going to be on people's mind. We heard Mir's words after the race. He called the crash stupid. He called it crazy. He wanted an apology, which apparently he got. And Alex Marquez did get a long lap penalty that he'll have to serve in Australia for that crash. But here's the problem. Here's my problem. I'll go back to this. Alex Marquez gets assessed that penalty and says, oh, I don't understand. Someone else ran into the back of me and they didn't get a penalty. Okay, but this is now the second incident this season where we can argue about Aragon. We can argue. Come on, argue with me about Aragon that it's a racing incident. It was Pecco's fault being too aggressive, but Alex was there. Stewards have to look at it and go, Alex Marquez, his name is on our naughty list again. We have to at least check it twice. And yet again, you've given them an excuse to look at the list and go, oh, Alex Marquez is on the list. Let me check it 3 times. You're going to get those penalties. And I think I saw that incident and I said, absolutely, he has to get a penalty. They have to send a message to him going, you need to ride under control. Because even when you don't crash, Alex, you feel a little out of control. Rein it in, buddy. That's what we need to see from you. Rein it in. And maybe when you're fighting for 12th, 13th, 14th, you don't have to be as aggressive as when you're fighting for the podium. Just a thought. I want to talk about another rider that's had some bad luck in MotoGP the last couple of weeks. And that's Fabio Quartararo, which we all know the story with Yamaha. They're not the fastest bike on the grid. Pretty slow, actually. They've had a really hard time over there. They showed him enough on paper, at least, to make him re-sign a contract. They showed some signs of form. They've shown some signs of improvement. They are faster than they were last year. It's just everyone else is faster yet. But like getting into Q2 in the last 3 races, finishing in the top 10, like you have to look at that as improvement. I talked about it last week on the podcast, how they were only 12 seconds off the win, which is the best of the season for them. But they have another problem, which seems a little self-inflicted, and that is fuel management. Let's go back to the tenets of racing. Fill in the blank. You cannot win a race if you do not finish the race. And what do you need to finish a race? You need gasoline. You need fuel. You need petrol, from my friends across the pond. You cannot finish a motorcycle race if you run out of gas. And this is now 2 times in the last 3 races, the Yamaha has run out of gas on the last lap. Luckily, both times Fabio was able to limp it home, but it cost him positions. It cost him a 5th place, and it's cost him a top 10 this week. And there's really no excuse for it. Like, how are you running out of gas? How are you doing the math wrong twice in 3 races? It's a formula. You know how long the race is. You know how much horsepower you have. You know every characteristic of the rider and the engine and what the rider is going to be seeing on track. We know Fabio is either going to be riding in a pack the entire race, or he's going to be riding all the way on his own. Those are the 2 choices. Those are the only 2 choices. He's going to be riding in a pack behind someone, so the fuel economy will be a little bit better in the draft, or he's going to be riding on his own, leading a pack. So the window of how much gas you need isn't infinite. It feels like we've been here before. We should know how to do this. We should know what mapping to set the bike at so that the bike makes the finish line with enough fuel to make the horsies run. Now, according to Fabio Quartararo, they have bells and whistles and alarms and alerts and all these things that should warn him if they are trending in the wrong direction with fuel consumption. He said none of that worked. None of it. He had no warning. He had no reason to change a fuel mapping, nothing. He called it unacceptable. The fact that they have systems in place that should tell him, hey, the bike's being a little thirsty. You need to change to a mapping that saves fuel. And we get it. Engineers, mechanics, the pit, they don't want to rein the power in on a motorcycle. They don't want to make it slower, give you less horsepower to fight with. But let's be honest, Yamaha, you're not fighting for a world title. You're just not. You're not fighting for the world title. So putting in a map, and I think Fabio said this in his debrief, of putting in a map that just gives me a couple less horsepower, what is it going to do? I'd still be fighting for 10th. I'd still be fighting where I was fighting. What are we trying to gain by the margins being so razor thin that I'm running out of gas 2 out of the last 3 races? Unacceptable. And this also goes back to a thing we talk about with the tire pressure, where everyone wants to be up in arms about this unfair tire pressure rule, and the tire pressure penalties are just so ridiculous. oh my gosh, this is going to cost teams podiums and victories. And well, the margins for the teams to set the tire pressure, they've even said themselves, are reasonable. It's the teams trying to manage and math out the razorest of thinnest margins to get the most advantageous position for their rider. How can we squeeze every bit of potential out of the bike? Let's just live on the edge and live dangerously on the edge to make sure that we have the grip we want, when we want it, we have the horsepower we want, we have the mapping we want. Let's make sure we are just pulling every bit of potential out of this bike. I get it when you're winning a world title. It may come back to bite you if you keep those edges too razor sharp. If you're living on the edge too much. Because a 16-second penalty for a Pecco or a Martin who's fighting for a championship could be the difference between winning a race and no points. And we haven't seen a lot of tire pressure infringement penalties from the top guys. Because you better believe both of those riders are looking at their crew chiefs going, listen, I want the bike to perform, but don't be setting this so close to the limit that you, in the garage, are costing me a win. If we think it's going to help me half a tenth a lap to have the pressure so close to the limit that we might get a penalty, trust me, the rider, to give you that half a tenth a lap. I will take that on myself to give you that time. Don't do it yourself. Don't make a mistake. Don't screw us over in the penalty box. And the same thing goes here with Yamaha and the fuel. They got to be able to finish a race. They got to be able to have enough fuel to get to the end. It's embarrassing. All the problems that Yamaha has, this absolutely shouldn't be one of them. Somebody shouldn't be embarrassed over there. Should be embarrassed over there. Tripped over my words. Somebody should be embarrassed over there. And I'm not saying someone needs to lose their job, but there definitely needs to be a meeting about what are we doing? We need to give the rider the bike that can actually finish and compete in a race, not a bike that's going to give up with half a lap to go. Get it together, y'all. A little sip of coffee. Sorry, a little sip of coffee. Jeff Goldblum says hi. The last thing I want to say is I want to address Marc Marquez's comments on Sunday. He kind of said it and said it and said it again, that the race was very boring. And we've seen that this year at tracks like, was it Austria and Japan, where it's very, very heavy braking and very, very heavy acceleration, that the Ducatis are just better in that area. But also, it kind of separates the pack. Because these guys aren't running very fast corner speed and rhythm type tracks, we're seeing that the difference in a lot of these riders is braking, especially early in races when they're kind of in a group. You know, some riders are more used to leading, some riders are more used to following. The braking markers are tricky. I think braking is the big thing this year in MotoGP, and it's where all the time is made up. It's where the guys who are really good show the difference between them and everyone else. And the bike that is really good show the difference between them and everyone else. But I also think that's why we're seeing so many mistakes out of people like Pecco and Jorge, is that they are risking so much on the brakes. The brakes matter so much, and the acceleration out of these corners means so much that they're taking a lot of risks. They're tucking the front a lot. They're losing. I mean, we saw Pedro Costa crash out twice this weekend trying to keep up to the Ducatis. So these hard braking circuits, I think, are exposing something about MotoGP, is maybe the, let's not call it unfairness, because all the bikes are built within the same rules, but it feels like the difference in the bikes and the riders really comes out when we look in the braking zone. And let's be honest, the braking zone is where the overtaking happens. And if the best riders are so much better at braking than anyone else, and they're already in front, what chance does the rest of the pack have? There's no chance for any of the other bikes that have a different strength to even compete with these heavy brakers, these really hard braking motorcycles. But I think if you've been watching me for long enough, you know what I think when people say that was a boring race. My quote is, if you watch a MotoGP race and you think it's boring, and honestly, if you watch any sport and you go, this is boring, you don't know enough about the sport to appreciate what you're actually seeing. Because on Sunday, there were some interesting things that happened. We talked about the crash with Joan Mir and Alex Marquez. We talked about the Pedro Acosta crash. We talked about, it wasn't quite a battle with Marquez and Bastianini, but Bastianini closing down Marquez and Marquez being able to kind of fend him off. And even at the front, Jorge Martin was closing to Pecco Bagnaia. There was anticipation there. There was a game of chess there. It wasn't all no action. I will give you, it was not a lot of overtaking. There wasn't a lot of easy to point out action. I think some MotoGP races and motorsports are like that. Sometimes races are kind of more of a game of lap time. It's a game against the clock. It's who's running what pace. And when you had someone like Pecco Bagnaia at the front running that massively consistent pace without making mistakes, you get a runaway race leader. It's happened in MotoGP before, y'all. It's happened in your famed two-stroke era that could do no wrong. We had runaway race leaders. We had runaway race winners winning by 30 seconds, a minute. We had riders being lapped. Even in the best of battles, the old Rossi, Lorenzo, Marquez, Casey Stoner, oh, the glory days. Aren't they perfect, guys? No, there were also runaway races where one person just pulled the pin. I mean, Jorge Lorenzo is famous for this. He's famous for getting to the front and then running extremely fast, extremely consistent laps that no one else could touch. This is not new. But what I want to offer you is a solution. I'm about solutions today. And I want to teach you the cure to a boring race. And that is experiencing the entire race weekend. I've talked before about how to watch MotoGP to get the most out of the weekend. So if you're showing up on Sunday and you're only watching the MotoGP race, and you're saying it's boring, it's kind of like turning on a basketball game at the end of the third quarter. Sometimes you're going to get a really great fourth quarter game. You will. Sometimes those games will be really close. But sometimes when you turn it on at the end of the third quarter in a basketball game, in a football game, the game's already out of hand. It's a blowout. It's one-sided. And the fourth quarter isn't much to watch. And so even if there's very good skill happening on the court, it's never close enough to be what you would call exciting. So if you're only tuning into the MotoGP race, that's what you're doing. You're turning on in the fourth quarter, and I can't help you because not every race is going to be a barnstormer to the end. Doesn't work that way. So here's what you need to do to get the most out of MotoGP. Now, the good news if you're in the US, and honestly, if you're anywhere, you can either watch MotoGP throughout the weekend like I do, watch a little on Friday, a little on Saturday, a little on Sunday, or you could go into a social media blackout zone. You should turn off the TikTok and turn off the YouTube and the Instagram and save all your MotoGP for Sunday. And then you can watch it in one block as if it's one sport. I have friends who spend 9-10 hours in front of the TV on Sunday watching football. You could do that with MotoGP. You could watch all of the action all weekend long, avoid spoilers, and watch it all in one sitting. I choose to spread it out over the course of a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, but to each his own. I'm not going to tell you how to live your life. I'm just trying to help you here. So here's how I watch MotoGP, and I want to take you through this weekend at the Japanese Grand Prix and why it was a really, really exciting weekend. So first of all, the first thing I watch every MotoGP weekend is the Thursday press conferences, the Gear Up show. You don't have to do that. I like the news. I talk to the news. I talk about the news to all you, so it feels like I need to know what's going on. But forgetting that, that's optional. Let's call that optional. It's not always great, but sometimes they have good people on. Sometimes you get a really good insight into the riders. I'm not the biggest fan of the Last on the Brakes podcast all the time, but they do have access to these MotoGP stars and team bosses, and you do get a really insider perspective that you're not going to get anywhere else. But the first session you really need to watch is Free Practice 1 on Friday. MotoGP Free Practice 1. Because that is going to get you up to speed for the weekend. That is the first quarter of the basketball game, the football game. Free Practice 1. The commentators are going to catch you up on all the things that are happening over the weekend, and it is going to give you a good test of who's going to be fast during the race and who's getting their setup right. Because those top 10 times don't matter as far as getting into qualifying and all that, but they do matter as far as bike setup. And you can tell, like, oh, wow, it looks like Aleix Espargaro having a really rough weekend. This weekend, Fabio Quartararo in a mid-pack, moving up, moving down. Wasn't his greatest weekend. We saw Taka Nakagami jump to the top of the timesheets in FP1. That's exciting at his home Grand Prix. I think we all knew he wasn't going to stay there, but obviously showing signs of life. We saw Pecco Bagnaia being very fast right away, which is a good sign for him. It's how I made my prediction that he would win the entire weekend, is that if he's fast early Friday, he's usually fast all season long, or all weekend long. Jorge Martin looked not happy in free practice 1. So there was a lot of drama, the setup to the drama. Again, first quarter stuff. Then we go into practice 2. Now practice 2, the top 10 move through to Q2. So practice 2 matters. You have to get your bike set up right, and then you got to put in some hot frickin' laps to get into that top 10. And we saw some people like Taka Nakagami almost make it into the top 10, and I think we were all cheering for him. We wanted to see him straight through to Q2 on that Honda in the home race at Japan. It wasn't to be. He was knocked off that 10th spot. He moves down to, I think it was 11th or 12th, had to go through Q1. But that was a moment of excitement there. We saw Jorge Martin up to speed. We saw Frankie Morbidelli running well. We saw the VR46 guys kind of in the mix. And that is where you really start to set the tone for the weekend. Now we know who's going to be fast over 1 lap speed. And practice matters, because if you don't get into Q2, there's no guarantee you can come through Q1. You may be starting the race in 15th place. And when you're a title contender, you're someone like Jack Miller, you're someone who's on a factory bike, you don't want to be starting in 15th place. You don't think the teams keep track of the starting position of their riders? They want to know who's qualifying good and who's qualifying bad. So free practice 2 is where is filled with action. It matters. It's not just, oh, it's practice, it doesn't matter, I can skip that one. It's the second quarter. We're in the second quarter now. Then we have qualifying. And Q1 maybe is the most intense session of the weekend, because you have, 12 riders, all vying for 2 positions that let them move on into Q2. And so you see these guys go for it. Especially if you have someone like Pecco Bagnaia, Jorge Martin, Marc Marquez, someone who really desperately needs to not start at the back of the grid. When you have them move forward, all the pressure is on them. They have this chance to get it right, or their weekend is ruined. And weekends are broken for riders in Q1. We've seen riders' weekends go to hell in qualifying 1. And this weekend we saw Frankie Morbidelli get through from Q1, but then we also saw Fabio Quartararo showing a little bit of pace, showing some fight, putting in some really hot, exciting laps to get himself out of Q1. Which, again, I keep saying every week. Maybe you're sick of it. The Yamaha has to be into Q2 every single week if we want to consider that they're improving, that they're not a bottom of the barrel. They want us to stop making fun of them for being slow. They got to be into Q2. It's just how it is. So there you have to watch Q1. And then Q2. Can we talk about the mayhem that happened in second qualifying in Japan? We have Jorge Martin riding fast, pushing hard, crashing out. Jorge Martin, the qualifying master, crashing out of qualifying. He has to start 11th. Moments later, we have Marc Marquez on a tear. I mean, obliterating. There was red sectors for everyone all over the track, but Marc blew the doors off the all-time lap record. Pole position, fastest lap. He loves this track. It's going to be a huge thing for the weekend, right? No, track limits violation. His tire hit the green. Confirmed later on. 100% the right call. He has to start from 9th. Huge, huge swing. Pecco running strong, gets second. And then we have Pedro Acosta setting his own all-time track record, taking pole position, the 3rd youngest pole sitter ever, behind Marc Marquez and Fabio Quartararo. Not bad company. Q2 this weekend, Japan, epically good. Epically good. So now we're at halftime for the weekend. I consider this halftime because these sessions are, they're not real races. There's no points awarded. They're exciting, but there's no points awarded. There are also no points awarded for leading into half in a basketball game. It doesn't matter whether the game is tied or you're being beat by 30. There's no wins. There's no wins awarded at halftime. So here we are, the halftime of the weekend. Are you following along? Free practice 1, practice, or practice 2 if you prefer. Qualifying 1, qualifying 2. All right? You're halfway through the MotoGP week. Let's get into the second half. We have the sprint, which counts for points. Some people don't like the sprint races. Some people think they're boring. It's just a preview. Who cares what happens? I like the sprint races. They're sometimes fun. They're sometimes frenetic. And we saw Pedro Acosta leading the sprint race on Saturday. Is he going to win his first sprint? The kid's pulling a gap. Pedro, please keep this on 2 wheels. And he doesn't do it. Crashes out. Poor Pedro. Head and hands before he even came to a stop in the gravel. We also saw Pecco Bagnaia, who has not been great in sprints over the last couple of years, win a sprint. We saw Jorge Martin charge through the pack into 4th. It's a pretty decent sprint, and it's not that long. It's not a huge time commitment. So I'm sorry if it isn't the most exciting moments you've ever had in your entire life. Didn't last very long. There you go. Move on with your life. But I thought it was pretty exciting. We're still in the middle of the third quarter because Sunday, race day, is a lot to watch. And again, if you're showing up to just watch MotoGP, you didn't understand the first half of the podcast this morning. Because Moto3, you need to be watching Moto3. It's always entertaining. It's always entertaining. The bikes are small, the riders are small, the riders are hungry, probably because the riders are small, and they're young, and they want to win, and they're scrappy, and they fight like hell. Even if it's a Moto3 race where it's not a fight into the last corner, into the last lap between 10 different riders, which sometimes it is. Sometimes these guys are going 4 wide into corners. These guys are racing hard, they're racing fast, they're racing close. It is must-watch television every single week. I will die on this hill. Then we have the Moto2 race, which we already talked about. Ogura, the big gamble, the drama in that championship. Sergio Garcia was at the top of the points, has faded ever since he was kind of dissed with that MotoGP ride. No MotoGP for you. Well, now you're going to be lucky to have a job at Moto2, man, if you don't show some form. Makes the big gamble in the race. It gets red flagged 2 laps in because of rain. Everyone goes out on wet tires with the exception of Ogura and a handful of others. Almost crashes by hitting the curb. Water sprays everywhere. He's able to keep it on 2 wheels, fights to the front, has a battle for the lead, ends up second place. Huge moment in the championship. Moto2 this year has been phenomenal. The change to the Pirelli tires has done that series wonders because it's made it so unpredictable. We could have never guessed at the way this championship has worked. Joe Roberts was leading, Sergio Garcia was leading, now Ogura is leading. It's been all over the place. It's always worth a watch. This season, Moto2, c'est magnifique. Now we're in the 4th quarter. We're in the 4th quarter of a MotoGP weekend, and you've had a lot of entertainment. And the MotoGP race to me was interesting because we did see Pecco just be Jorge Lorenzo-esque perfect. Right? Like, it was just perfection. And that's why no one could touch him. That's why Jorge could never really get that gap down underneath 6/10. But he tried. And seeing Jorge come from 11th, storming through to 2nd, it's hard for me to be like, yeah, that's a super boring race. And I did think Enea was catching Mark. And that battle, even though it wasn't a battle of overtakes, was definitely a battle. Because Enea was pushing absolutely as hard as he could. He wanted to be on the podium. He wanted to beat Mark. He wants as many podiums and wins as he can have before he leaves Ducati because he may never stand on a podium again. Let's just be honest. He's on the best bike of the grid. He's not going to be on the best bike of the grid next year. So he's pushing like hell to stay there. Further back, we had a little bit of a skirmish. Again, we had the Joan Mir and Alex Marquez thing happening. Is it the most exciting race I've ever seen? No. Was I bored throughout it? Not really. Because again, think about it this way. That race is a lot about anticipation. And MotoGP and motor sports in general is a lot about anticipation. Sometimes everyone races really close, elbow to elbow, and then it just kind of fans out and people finish. And sometimes it's absolute mayhem and there's no warning what you're going to get, especially this season. You're telling me when Pecco Bagnaia was leading the race by a second and Jorge Martin was closing it down, that you weren't on the edge of your seat going, if you're a Jorge Martin fan, Jorge, please keep it on two wheels. Please don't throw it away. I know you're reeling off fastest laps of the race, but please don't throw it away. And if you're a Pecco Bagnaia fan, you can't tell me that you weren't going, Pecco, please don't make a mistake. Don't throw these points away. Like the championship will be over this weekend if you throw more points away to Jorge. Now, because they didn't crash, it's boring? Okay. I can see why it's boring from Marc Marquez's perspective. He ran a very lonely race in third. He wasn't competitive to the front. He was never going to be competitive at the front. That really hot lap in qualifying was kind of the highlight of his weekend, and that's where it kind of began and ended. So, I get you, Mark. Kind of a boring race for you. And if you tuned in the fourth quarter this weekend to the start of the MotoGP race, I can understand why you might think, this was a little boring. But the weekend overall in Japan was amazing. From start to finish, first practice, second practice, qualifying, sprint, and the main race. From start to finish, our championship is only 10 points. 10 points with 4 races to go. So many points left to grab. And the championship is going to come down to the very, very end yet again. Stop complaining. It's been a fantastic season. Or keep complaining. I'm not your mother. All right, that wraps it up. This has been the Monday Morning MotoGP podcast brought to you by Horsepower Rodeo. Please like, follow, share, mash all the buttons here on TikTok. And if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe there as well, or here as well, I guess, if you're watching on YouTube. I thank you, everyone, for coming in, liking, following, sharing, and talking in the chat. We'll see you next week. And little programming note, we're going to do a micro podcast tomorrow morning where I'm going to talk about the predictions I made on Friday, and we're going to see how those predictions kind of unfolded. And so that is going to be a new micro podcast tomorrow morning, Tuesday, and I am tentatively calling it I Told You So Tuesday.